most of the people watching this know exactly where they were when two hijacked passenger planes took down the World Trade Center in New York City on the 11th of September 2001. Many also remember the talk in the media about a possible clash of civilizations between the Western or European world and the Islamic world. At the time, there was also a Palestinian uprising in Israel and daily terror attacks. And people wondered if we might see similar scenes on Western streets one day. Many also wondered how is this type of radicalism that we have seen on 9/11, people who are willing to sacrifice their own lives to kill innocent civilians in the West, how is this related to the religion of Islam? A word often heard those days was fundamentalism, meaning a literal interpretation of the Quran and the Islamic faith. A better term, which only appeared in mainstream discourse many years later, and perhaps a more appropriate term, is Islamism, namely political Islam, that is, taking Islamic writings as a political doctrine and acting upon that doctrine. So Islamism seems like a proper term for the type of radicalism we are seeing. And the most radical Islamists one calls jihadists, namely radical Islamists who are militants of this political doctrine. The problem with Islamism is that Islamists themselves do not acknowledge the fact that they use Islam as a political doctrine. In fact, they claim that they are true believers. They are the only true Muslims. After 9/11, there was also immediately a type of Islamic apologism appearing in the West. Many politicians, perhaps out of fear, others out of sheer political correctness, called on people to respect Islam. People like this were mostly found on the left, but not exclusively. In Europe, also many Christian Democrats were Islamic apologists, and still are. And also in the United States, conservatives contributed to this. The phrase, Islam is a religion of peace, was first uttered, for example, by George W. Bush. But indeed, there were also some people, and still are, who claim like radical Islam doesn't even exist, it is all just Islam. Every single follower of that religion is an extremist, because the religion in itself is extremist. The truth is, of course, a little bit more complicated, because if we look at the Middle East, the larger region of the Middle East, some decades ago, in the 1950s, 1960s, we see that many women were not even wearing headscarves. Islam was part of life, but it wasn't such an important part of life like it is now. So this kind of fundamentalism, this literal interpretation, has existed since the beginning of Islam, but it can get activated in certain circumstances, and in other circumstances it can weaken to a point where its influence is minor. The first Palestinian terrorists were not jihadists, but more secular nationalists, even Christians among them. And of course we also have native European Muslim populations in Southeastern Europe. And it is very hard to claim that all these people are adherents to a radical political doctrine. After 9/11, the international political stage was shocked by many more incidents related to radical Islamism. We had the London and the Madrid bombings. We also had the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, and we had the Danish cartoon controversy, which saw huge riots in parts of the Muslim world. Also, we had the invasion of Afghanistan, which was controlled by the radical Taliban regime, which was harboring some of the 9/11 planners of Al-Qaeda. But we also witnessed the disastrous invasion in Iraq by the United States and Great Britain, which had nothing to do with 9/11, but could be seen in the same light and would be of major importance for the later development of radical Islam across the world. From 2008 onwards, Europe was faced with an economic crisis, and the issue of Islamism was no longer making daily headlines. This changed again with the Arab Spring, which quickly turned into an Arab winter. The predictions that this was an uprising similar to the one in 1989 in Eastern Europe, a process of democratization, unfortunately did not come true. The Arab Spring resulted in a string of civil wars from Yemen to Libya to Iraq and, of course, Syria, which saw the birth of a group even more terrible and more radical than Al-Qaeda, namely the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Just at the time when ISIS was declaring war on the rest of the world, a major flow of refugees from the war-torn Middle East was making its way to Europe. We cannot refrain from mentioning now the influence of Angela Merkel's decision to invite unlimited numbers of refugees, and by doing so, de facto nullifying Europe's outside borders. Just at a time of major radical Islamic insurgencies across the world, hundreds of thousands of people came into Europe. Some, a small part, but some among them, turned out to be terrorists. This first became clear with the Paris massacre in late 2015, and since then, many more atrocities by jihadists on the streets of our continent. In the meantime, the apologism for Islam has gone completely out of control, with Islamophobia Awareness Month, the praising of the burqa, the normalization of the hijab, and many similar types of Islamic apologism meant to appease the Muslim populations of Western Europe, which undergo at the moment also a process of self-Islamization. Of course, there were Muslims before, only the religion has become a bigger part of people's lives in the suburbs of cities like Brussels, Paris, and Rotterdam. Of course, also anti-Islamic hatred is also out of control. People like Geert Wilders and many others are doing their best to spread an image of Islam that is as terrible as one can imagine, conflating the worst parts of Islamic extremism with the entire religion. Only it is not surprising that we see something like this, since a large part of the establishment does not address the problem properly. They do not declare radical Islamism to be a major enemy of the West. Before Trump was elected in the United States, the enemy in public discourse didn't even have a name. We saw regular massacres in Europe, and we couldn't even name the perpetrators or their ideology. There was just vague talk about radicalism, the dark vision of the future that some people had just after 9/11, that Europe would become a kind of West Bank with almost daily terror attacks, unfortunately has partly come true. Every few days we hear again of some barbaric maniac attacking random European civilians with a knife, with a car, or in any other way. It is important to realize that we must fight this evil. We must name it. Politicians must declare war on it. And at the same time, we should not turn ourselves to backwardness and sacrifice our values, democracy and freedoms. We should stand for the free West and for our European culture against radical Islamism. Many people have had enough. And if you want to counter anti-Muslim bigotry, the first step is to make this problem a top priority and discuss it, not by praising the burqa or by organizing Islamophobia Awareness Month, but by standing for a free and secular society with freedom of religion, and by stopping mass immigration from the Islamic world, and also by taking away the passports of known jihadists and extremists and deport them once and for all from Europe. The fight against radical Islam is a generational struggle, but in the end, like always, we will prevail. Long live Europe, long live European civilization.